In 1992, a Microsoft programmer named Ed Fries buried a small piece of code inside Excel 4.0 that had nothing to do with spreadsheets at all. Years earlier, fresh out of college, Fries had applied for a job at Lotus Development Corporation and been rejected. He kept that rejection letter framed above his desk while he went on to help build Microsoft's own spreadsheet instead. The code he hid inside Excel 4.0 was a private joke born from that memory. Trigger it. And a small box labeled with the numbers 123 begins to shake, splits open, and spills a swarm of animated bugs across the screen before the Excel logo comes bouncing in, boots the whole mess off screen, and flashes the caption "No problemo." It's an astonishingly petty thing for a piece of widely used business software to have sitting inside it, and Microsoft's own engineers knew it at the time. By their own account, years later, the internal rule for hiding jokes like this in the code was that they had to be unreachable, with nothing in the finished shipping product that could actually trigger them for an ordinary user. And yet, buried in that very same version of Excel, sitting quietly in the options menu to this day, more than 30 years later, is something almost opposite in spirit. An entire hidden system still present in current versions of Excel that lets you navigate with Lotus 123's old keystrokes, write formulas in Lotus 123's old syntax, and even summon a menu labeled Lotus 123 Help. One piece of code mocks Lotus's death. The other quietly and patiently makes it easier to defect. Microsoft built both into the very same product at the very same time, and that tells you almost everything about how this particular war was actually won. You remember the specific tactile violence of the / key. If you ever sat in front of a beige monitor running Lotus 123, press it, and a menu unrolled along the top of the screen in stark green or amber text. Worksheet, range, copy, move, file, print, graph, data, system, quit. Each word a doorway into another list of words, and if you'd been trained properly, you never actually read any of it. You just type the letters from memory /WER for worksheet erase range, fingers moving faster than your eyes, the way a pianist stops looking at the keys. You remember opening a worksheet, not yet universally called a spreadsheet file. The vocabulary itself hadn't fully settled. And watching a grid of cells stretch out further than your screen could show, so you learn to navigate half blind, jumping with the arrow keys, the home key, the end key, tracking the little cell reference in the corner as it ticked from A1 toward wherever your numbers actually lived. You remember typing a formula that began with a plus sign or an @ symbol instead of an equal sign. And you remember recording a macro, not by clicking a button, but by literally typing out the keystrokes you wanted, repeated, saved as a small string of characters tucked into a hidden cell, so that a macro was less a recorded action than a kind of transcription, a script written in the same language you already spoke to the machine every day. And you remember, if you were an office worker anywhere between the mid-1980s and the early 1990s, that 123 wasn't really the name of a program so much as the name of a professional skill. You didn't say you knew how to use a spreadsheet, you said you knew 123, the way an earlier generation of office workers said they knew shorthand. The program that made those keystrokes worth memorizing had a strange accelerated birth. Its story starts with VisiCalc, written by Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston, and released in 1979 for the Apple II, widely credited as the first spreadsheet program and the reason many small businesses bought a computer at all. When IBM's PC arrived in 1981, VisiCalc's publisher shipped little more than a straight port built for older, more limited machines, rather than a program designed around the PC's new capabilities. Mitch Kapor, a former VisiCalc product manager, saw the opening. Together with programmer Jonathan Sachs and backed by roughly $5 million raised from venture capitalists, including Ben Rosen, Kapor founded Lotus Development Corporation in 1982 and set out to build something native to the PC from the ground up. A program that combined a spreadsheet, charting, and basic database functions in a single package, which is where the name 123 came from. Lotus spent over $1 million on advertising in the weeks surrounding launch, an almost unheard of marketing budget for a piece of software at the time, and it worked. Lotus 123 shipped on January 26th, 1983, priced at $495 as part of a PC setup that could easily run $5,000 all in, and within 9 months had sold roughly 110,000 copies. First year revenue hit $53 million, blowing past Capcor's own internal forecast of $3 to $4 million by more than tenfold. By the end of 1983, Lotus was the second largest software company on Earth, behind only Microsoft, with about 250 employees, a number that doubled again within a year. Lotus went public in October 1983, and 123 became so thoroughly the industry standard that, for the rest of the decade, compatibility with its menus and macros was treated as close to a prerequisite for any rival spreadsheet hoping to be taken seriously by a corporate buyer. For most of the 1980s, there wasn't really a spreadsheet war. There was Lotus, and there was everyone else fighting over what was left. Ask most people today why Lotus 123 lost, and the answer is usually some version of Lotus was too slow to build a version for Windows, and by the time it did, Excel had already won. This is true, and worth taking seriously before moving past it. Lotus 123 for Windows didn't ship until September 1991, a full 4 years after Excel had already been running on Windows, and 6 years after Excel existed at all. The Windows version Lotus finally released was, by most contemporary accounts, a rushed and underpowered translation of the DOS product, rather than something designed around a mouse from the start. Genuine point-and-click competence didn't really arrive until Release 4 in June 1993, by which point Excel had already established itself as the clear market leader. All of that is accurate. But they were late doesn't explain why a company with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, an enormous existing customer base, and years of advance warning that graphical interfaces were coming simply failed to get there in time. Being late to a product cycle happens to well-run companies constantly, and they usually catch up within a release or two. Lotus never did. The real question isn't why Lotus shipped its Windows version late. It's why an organization with every resource it needed kept, year after year, choosing to spend its energy somewhere other than fixing that. The deeper answer is that Lotus and Microsoft were operating on two different theories of what would come after the keyboard-driven, DOS-based world both companies had grown up in, and Lotus had far more invested in being wrong. Microsoft's Excel had actually been forced to solve the graphical interface problem years earlier than anyone at Lotus needed to, for an almost accidental reason. Excel's first home, starting in 1985, was the Apple Macintosh, a machine with no keyboard-driven convention to preserve and, crucially, no installed base of Lotus loyalists to protect. Building Excel for the Mac meant building a spreadsheet around a mouse and pull-down menus from day one, because there was no other option available. By the time Windows 3.0 turned the graphical interface into the PC industry's default in May 1990, going on to sell roughly 4 million copies in its first year alone, Microsoft had already spent 5 years learning how to make a spreadsheet behave that way. Lotus, meanwhile, spent those same years making two very different bets, both of which quietly assumed the future would still resemble the past. The first was a platform bet. Lotus poured much of its engineering effort into supporting OS/2, the operating system IBM and Microsoft were jointly developing as the intended successor to DOS, rather than racing to build for Windows. It was a head fake by Microsoft. John Landry, who served as Lotus's chief technology officer at the time, later said of the episode, Microsoft itself walked away from OS/2 once Windows 3.0's runaway success became undeniable, letting the IBM partnership quietly collapse around 1991 and leaving the Lotus's bet stranded on a platform the rest of the industry was already abandoning. The second bet was legal rather than technical. Rather than pouring its resources into rebuilding 123 around a mouse, Lotus spent much of the early 1990s in court, suing rival Borland for copying the exact structure of 123's /key menu system and its keystroke-based macro language inside Borland's competing Quattro Pro spreadsheet. A district court initially sided with Lotus in 1993. An appeals court reversed that ruling in 1995, finding that a menu structure couldn't be copyrighted at all. And in January 1996, the Supreme Court split 4 to 4, let the reversal stand without setting any national precedent. The fight had consumed the better part of 6 years and untold legal fees on both sides. And by the time it was finally over, Borland had already sold its entire spreadsheet business, and the war for the spreadsheet market itself was long since decided. PC Magazine, sizing up the situation in a widely read 1993 column, put it bluntly. Lotus looked less like a company adapting to a new market and more like one being quietly held hostage by its own most devoted users, the way an earlier generation of loyal Apple II owners had once made it harder for Apple itself to move on. So much of Lotus's identity, its macro language, and its engineering culture were built around an interface an entire generation of customers had already memorized by heart. An unwinding that meant asking the people who had made the company successful to start over as beginners. Both bets, the platform bet and the legal one, shared the same underlying logic. Protect the asset that had made Lotus dominant, the keystroke-driven interface and the community fluent in it, rather than risk it by building something genuinely new. That instinct was completely rational for a company holding 90% of its market in 1985. It was fatal for one competing against a rival that had never had the luxury of that asset in the first place, and so had nothing it needed to protect. By the numbers, the unwinding is stark and easy to trace. Lotus 1.2.3 for Windows. Release 1 finally arrived in September 1991, widely regarded even by sympathetic reviewers as a weak, hurried port. Release 4 for Windows, the version most historians consider genuinely competitive, didn't appear until June 1993, and multiple industry analyses placed the moment Excel overtook 1.2.3 in overall market share at around that same year, meaning Lotus's best Windows product arrived at almost exactly the moment it stopped being able to change the outcome. Astonishingly, Lotus kept investing in the platform it was supposedly leaving behind even after that, a new DOS release. Version 4.0 shipped in mid-1994, 3 full years, after Windows 3.0 had already become the PC industry's default, at a point when many industry analysts had fully expected Lotus to abandon DOS entirely. Also in 1994, Borland sold its entire spreadsheet business, Quattro Pro, to Novell, effectively removing the second largest remaining challenger from the field and leaving the contest as a two-way race Lotus was already losing badly. Meanwhile, Microsoft had folded Excel into a new bundle called Microsoft Office. First assembled in 1990 and aggressively priced from the early 1990s onward, so that buying Excel increasingly meant getting Word and PowerPoint alongside it for barely more than the price of one standalone application, a pricing structure that standalone competitors like Lotus, which had no equivalently dominant word processor of its own to bundle in return, simply couldn't match. By 1995, with 1.2.3's market share reduced to a shrinking core of loyal enterprise accounts, Lotus was acquired by IBM for $3.5 billion. But by IBM's own framing at the time, the acquisition was overwhelmingly about a different Lotus product entirely, the email and collaboration platform Lotus Notes with the spreadsheet that had built the company's name along for the ride as a legacy asset rather than the prize. Lotus 1, 2, 3 technically limped on for years afterward, folded into a bundle called Lotus Smart Suite, and given further updates under IBM, but it never again seriously contested Excel's position. IBM formally discontinued Lotus 1, 2, 3 altogether on September 30th, 2014, more than 31 years after its launch. A quiet ending that most of the software industry had simply assumed had already happened years earlier. Almost nothing of Lotus 1.2.3 as a standalone product survives today, but the war left visible scar tissue on the winning side. That hidden Lotus 1.2.3 help system built into Excel is still there in current versions, buried under options and advanced settings, a menu built to welcome refugees from a war that ended before most of today's Excel users were even born. The .wk1 file format Lotus popularized became, for a time, as close to a universal spreadsheet standard as existed anywhere, and faint traces of that legacy still occasionally surface in old file conversion tools. Mitch Kapor went on to become a prominent figure in internet policy, co-founding the Electronic Frontier Foundation in 1990 to advocate for digital civil liberties, a second act with essentially no connection to spreadsheets at all. Lotus's other major product, the email and scheduling platform Lotus Notes, actually outlived 123 by decades inside IBM, continuing to be developed and sold long after the spreadsheet that had built the company's name had quietly vanished from store shelves. A strange inversion in which the side project ended up outliving the product the entire company was originally named for. Borland's Quattro Pro and WordPerfect, the other great DOS-era best-of-breed applications that Lotus had once stood alongside as a peer, followed a nearly identical path into irrelevance. Both were sold to Novell in 1994, then sold again to Corel in 1996, and both survive today only as niche products with a small fraction of their former relevance, part of the same broad generation of software that had assumed the keyboard, not the mouse, would remain the primary way people talk to a computer. Even the keystroke instinct itself left a faint fingerprint on the winning side. Press the Alt key in modern Excel, and small letters still appear over every menu item. A keyboard-only path through the software for anyone who never fully trusted the mouse. A distant, muted echo of the slash key menus it was designed to make obsolete. Somewhere in Microsoft's source code, that small animation is presumably still sitting dormant. The numbers 1, 2, and 3 shaking apart, spilling bugs, getting booted off screen by a logo that never even had to say anything clever. Just two dismissive words and a bounce. It's tempting to read Lotus 123's collapse as a story about arrogance. A company too in love with its own keystrokes to notice that the world had moved on without asking permission. But arrogance isn't quite the right word for it. Lotus did notice. It just kept betting year after year that its history, its interface, its macros, its 90% market share, its devoted users who could type an entire command before you'd finished reading the menu was an asset worth defending rather than a weight it needed to learn to put down. Sometimes the thing that built you is also the thing you can't set down in time to survive what comes next. If this is the kind of history you come here for, subscribe, and the next relic will be waiting when you are.